Do you believe that anger can last longer than half a lifetime? It doesn't just endure. It grows, slowly eroding your health and stealing your peace. The story of George and Helen is a testament to the burden of 50 years of hatred. They cut each other off because of an old accusation. But as they entered their 80s, they realized the greatest success isn't about winning or losing, but about finding inner peace. Is it too late to dismantle a feud that has become part of their very identity? Start of the story: George, 82, lived in a small wooden house tucked among the pine forests of rural New England, USA. He was a stern man, his hands calloused from his retired carpentry trade. George's life was passed in isolation, accompanied only by the sound of his saw and a silence that had stretched for 50 years. That silence was the wall separating him from everything, especially from his late wife's sister Helen. Their feud began in 1975. Following the sudden death of George's brother-in-law, George and his brother-in-law had run a small construction business together. When the company went bankrupt, George became convinced that Helen and her husband had secretly withdrawn all the capital, leaving him to shoulder the debt and the humiliation. Although there was no clear evidence, his wounded pride transformed this belief into an ironclad truth in George's mind. He cut off all contact, refusing every attempt at explanation. For 50 years, the mere mention of Helen's name would cause his blood pressure to spike. Helen, 80, lived only a 20-minute drive from George. She was a retired teacher, gentle, but carried an unspoken sorrow. Her greatest pain wasn't the loss of her husband, but George's silent judgment. She tried to reach out and send letters, but all were rejected. She understood that George's silence was his way of protecting his hurt, yet it was a psychological burden she had to bear. She constantly wondered if she would die without her brother-in-law's forgiveness, despite believing in her innocence. The issue began to seriously affect George's health. He constantly struggled with insomnia, unstable blood pressure, and chronic anxiety. According to research by the U.S. National Institutes of Health, NIH, accumulated anger and chronic hostility increased the level of cortisol, the stress hormone, and adrenaline in the blood, causing continuous vasoconstriction. This explains why every time he thought of Helen, George felt chest tightness. He had learned to live with his anger as a constant companion. It defined him. It was his reason for maintaining his stubbornness and isolation. Geriatric psychologists call this the identity trap. Anger had become part of his identity, and giving it up meant facing the raw pain underneath. The turning point occurred last winter. George suffered a minor stroke. He was lucky to survive, but his right hand mobility was affected. In the hospital, his daughter, Sarah, a nurse, was desperate watching her father still stubbornly refuse to see anyone, especially when Helen was mentioned. Sarah, who had heard the story since childhood and always felt something was wrong, decided to become a family history detective. She started searching through old documents related to the collapsed construction company 50 years ago. She found old invoices, ledgers, and finally, a faded letter tucked deep inside her grandmother's drawer. The letter revealed a painful truth. The person who caused the biggest financial mistake was not Helen's husband, but George's own younger brother, who had covered up the incident out of fear. George had emotionally dumped his rage onto Helen out of emotional convenience, as she was an outsider, easier to blame than his own flesh and blood. When Sarah confronted George with the letter, he was stunned. Half a century of hatred shattered in an instant. His anger dissolved into overwhelming regret and shame. George agreed to meet Helen. The first meeting took place at a neutral cafe. Helen arrived, her hair white as clouds, but still retaining her elegance. George looked at her, seeing her frailty and the tired look in the eyes of his sister-in-law, and his heart clenched. He had wasted 50 years. He spoke first, not with defensiveness, but with admission. "Helen, I was wrong. I blamed you for half a century because I was too cowardly to face the truth." Helen didn't cry, she simply nodded. "I know you're not a bad man, George. I know you were hurt. But for 50 years your silence took away so much." They began the process of healing, not quickly, but slowly, painfully. They learned to redefine success at age 80. It was peace, not being right or wrong. Sarah brought them to a marriage counselor, though they weren't a couple to help them untangle the emotional knots. The therapist explained, "Forgiveness is not the act of forgetting. It is the act of relinquishing the right for that anger to control your life." They began learning to accept that they couldn't get back the 50 lost years, but they could protect the remaining decade. They began doing simple things together, sharing tea, fixing an old oak table. George, for the first time in 50 years, felt his blood pressure truly stabilize without needing medication. The hatred was removed, and his body was freed from the cortisol burden. A year later, George and Helen were not just relatives but close friends. They celebrated Christmas together. George often drove to Helen's house to garden with her. George taught Helen how to safely use a saw, and Helen taught George how to care for roses. Their success was not in how easily they forgave. but in how they were brave enough to confront their regret and pain when they could have simply chosen to die in their stubbornness. They won the final war, the victory over their own pride. And you, are you carrying an unnecessary burden of 5, 10, or 50 years? Remember, the greatest success in old age is finding inner peace. Don't let meaningless pride steal your remaining precious years. Please share this story. Click subscribe to receive more success stories that help you find joy and health in your senior years.